Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi asks people to work together to create a new India in the next 5 years. What are major challenges facing a new India? India has surpassed China as the world's fastest growing economy and is forecast to be so for the next 10 years. Will the Indian economy overtake China's? India is the largest democracy in the world. Some say Indian democracy has been undermined because of corrupt politicians and poor governance. But others disagree. Is democracy in India a success or failure? Both China and India are emerging markets with big potential for development. As the border standoff between China and India continues, is a dragon-elephant showdown inevitable? How does India position China, Russia and the United States in its foreign policy? Welcome to the second chapter of our special series devoted to rediscovery of India. India is proud to be the largest democratic state on the planet and continues to have high hopes for the future of its democratic process. How does this Western political system work for India? In what ways has India made its own system unique, and will it have the power and the flexibility to help revitalize India and transform it into a long-term global power? To discuss the characteristics of Indian democracy in this, the second part of our India series, I'm happy to be joined in the studio by Rong Ying, Vice President of the China Institute of International Studies, and Dr. Clifford Kirokoff, former senior professional staff member of the U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee. We shall also speak to Professor M.D. Nalapad from Manipal University via satellite. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Yang Ray. Gentlemen, many overseas observers who follow the development of India, economic, social, and political alike, say, look, the success of India will always be a myth. Now that reminds me of what some of the American scholars said in the wake of the Cold War. They say the success of one country's nation-making would only depend on a successful combination of a liberal democracy with a liberal market economy. Now, India is obviously such a role model, quote-unquote. Now, obviously, we are watching out. It's, after all, the most populous democracy and the largest neighboring economy of China. What do you think of what could happen to India?
Yeah, it is true. I think if you look at the population, India is the second largest population, and it has been undertaken, kind of adopted kind of a form of government we call the democracy for past, I think, decades, almost past, except for a very brief period. And it has been a miracle compared to other sort of post-colonial states that won the independence more or less the same time. But I think there are, I mean, it is always a kind of a debatable thing that on the one hand, I think whether this is really the best system or best form of government for India. Otherwise, that if India had taken a different system, whether India would be able to solve the problems now having political, economical, and societal level in a better way. But arguably, I personally believe that possibly it is because of the society, of the history, because of the national conditions, and more importantly, that I think we have nothing. So far, we have to deal with or live with that kind of system India has taken.
Democracy is, of course, a very attractive idea or discourse in analyzing different forms of governance that developing countries exercise to navigate their own course of development. India is, of course, a very interesting target of our academic studies. So what do you think of the alleged myth of Indian growth, development, and social progress?
Well, I think their example they've set over the last 70 years has been very impressive. Despite challenges of a very large population and a very diverse society, they did have the advantage in some ways of being able to bring on the Western parliamentary system that Britain had already sort of installed, and also British law as a way in the transition, kind of maybe it helped their transition. So you do have some democratic features built in with that, the old British parliamentary system and legal system. I've been to India a number of times. I've been to their parliament, seen very vigorous debates in the parliament. I've been in their Supreme Court, and I've witnessed very vigorous defense and such in their Supreme Court.
And India also
orderly.
boasts of a very free media.
Yes.
Check and balance in the Congress. So let me go
Yes.
back, let me go to Professor Nalapat for a typical Indian analysis about their political institutions. Hello, Professor Nalapat.
Hello, how are you?
I'm fine. 2 years ago, Prime Minister Modi took office.
Go ahead.
2 years ahead of the campaign success of Donald Trump, who benefited enormously from the rise of populism. Everybody understands that Prime Minister Modi is the head of BJP, which is allegedly the platform of Indian nationalism. Do you also view the campaign success of Mr. Modi as a solid evidence of the success of populism in your country? And populism is arguably one kind of democracy which is not a very reasonable democracy, so to speak.
Well, I'd like to say that Prime Minister Modi got the votes he did mainly because of the promise of development and the promise of a cleaner administrative system. The problem in India is that we did introduce the Western democratic system, which I think has served us very well. But we also retained the colonial bureaucracy. And that bureaucracy has had enormous powers over the citizen, with the result that a lot of citizens' initiatives, a lot of the freedom of the citizen gets affected because of the overriding powers of the bureaucracy. So there was no reform of the bureaucracy. The political system was reformed from a colonial to a Western democratic model, but we have not reformed our bureaucracy from a colonial Western bureaucracy to a Western bureaucracy which functions in their own countries.
Well, all big governments could be called a monster system of bureaucratic red tapes. Well, I hate to call China also a monster bureaucracy. However, don't forget, President Xi Jinping and his team start to overhaul the huge bureaucratic machine in China's political institutions, with the core leadership as the most important phenomenon in Chinese politics. Now, China is called by Western observers autocracy as opposed to liberal democracy. Now, when it comes to the efficiency of economic reform, which system do you think would work most effectively?
I think there's always been an interesting comparison or contrast, particularly regarding India and China, where I think if you look at their performances, particularly in terms of delivery of the services by the government, I think certainly China is much ahead of India. And as a matter of fact, Prime Minister Modi himself has said many times that India should learn from China, learn from China's experience, and learn from particularly the efficiency and effectiveness when a decision is made and it can deliver.
But I'm afraid a defined Prime Minister Modi and a triumphant BJP in India may start to change their mind when you say they should learn more from China.
Yeah, I mean, of course we have a different system, different sort of conditions here. And I would say, I would argue that China cannot be India, and India certainly cannot be the Chinese. The question is that there's always kind of a wish that this different system, the advantages or merits of systems like democracy or whatever, or quasi could be sort of used by the particular country. But I think here we are talking about different, two different models with totally different culture and different conditions. I only can say that why China adopt the system now, we call the system of Chinese socialism, Chinese characters. While here we have the India, we have the democracy, maybe we can call with Indian characteristics, whatever. It all depends on the conditions and all. But the most important thing, it depends on the choice of the people. So that is the most important.
But careful, Western observers tend to argue, look, we have universal values, and that's the only thing that should matter universally, regardless of your cultural diversity, your history, your religious and ethnic divisions in developing countries. So what do you think of the counter-argument from developing countries which point out, look, liberal democracy starts to beat retreat, particularly in recent years. Look at the Brexit and the success of populism in American politics.
Well, I think the Western so-called experts that you mentioned are very narrow-minded and misread the international society, which is characterized by diversity and many different cultures with many different characteristics. And so for some of these Western academics or specialists to kind of play a Eurocentric or a Western-centric perspective, in my view, doesn't square with world history.
Undeniably, we have bad democracy and benevolent dictatorship, perhaps, in a world which is characterized increasingly by cultural diversity and different forms of governance. So let me go back to Professor Nalapat. Now, what is it about Indian democracy that has prompted the rapid economic expansion under the leadership of Prime Minister Modi?
Well, the main thing is that Prime Minister Modi campaigned on the slogan of minimum government and maximum governance. Modi is a practical man coming from a state where business is front and center, the most important occupation. You take a state like Bihar, there working for the government is the most important occupation. In Gujarat, private industry is much more important than government, and Modi comes from that state. So from that point of view, he's tried to lessen the interface between government and the people. For example, by using the internet, by using Digital India to try and ensure that services are made digital. And he's done that on a massive scale. About 1 billion people, for example, have now got their digital fingerprints and other things mapped out in what is called the Aadhaar scheme, and which is now useful across a range of services. So Modi is trying to downsize the government. And the problem that India has been facing is that we have a political system which is good, which recognizes diversity, but we have a bureaucracy that abhors, that hates diversity, and which wants to put the 1.26 billion people of India into one single scheme, into one single mode of operation. So this battle against the bureaucracy, against the colonial bureaucracy, is what we are seeing today, and hopefully Prime Minister Modi will succeed where several of his predecessors have failed, and ensure that we have a democratic bureaucracy and not just a democratic polity, because a polity cannot really give the freedoms that a citizen needs unless the bureaucracy is similarly free of this kind of colonial reflex of trying to control every aspect of a citizen's life.
What do you think of the phrase of a strongman politics in a democracy? Don't you think India has experienced too much of an overdose of democracy, and therefore your country, which is characterized with so much of ethnicity and religious diversity, which often resulted in bloodshed? For example, a few years ago in Gujarat, the home state of your Prime Minister, and therefore this country badly needs strongmen. They don't want any overdose of democracy. Does it make any sense?
Well, I'd like to say that Chief Minister Modi was very successful. Yes, there was a problem when a few months after he took over, but after that there was not a single death due to interreligious tension in Gujarat, unlike several other states where there were frequently this kind of eruption. I mean, this is a 1.26 billion country of multiple faiths, multiple communities and multiple castes. The important point to remember is that Prime Minister Modi is the first Prime Minister from what we in India call the backward castes. Now today you have a situation where the President of India comes from the Dalit community, which is supposed to be the most disadvantaged community. Prime Minister Modi comes from a very backward community that frankly had very low economic success throughout history. And our Vice President also, Mr. Naidu, who's just been elected, also comes from a backward community. This is the first time in 70 years that the President, Vice President and Prime Minister all come from the most disadvantaged sections of Indian society. So definitely I think this is evidence that India is going through a social transformation.
Thank you so much. We appreciate what is happening during this process of deep social and economic transformation in India. You are watching Dialogue with Mr. Rong Ying, Vice President of the China Institute of International Studies, Dr. Clifford Karakoff, a former senior professional staff member of the U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and Professor Nalapad from Manipur University in India. We are discussing how to look at the democracy in India and whether it works for the economic development of this largest neighboring country of China. This is our second chapter of a special series to rediscover India. Please stay with us. Welcome back. The issue of ethnicity starts to tear apart the social and economic, if not political, fabric of regional blocs such as European Union. If you look at the explosive growth population of Muslims in continental Europe. Hence we see the Brexit as well as the rise of a far-right movement in European Union. India and China might not be the exception. For example, we have the East Turkestan Islamic movement in Xinjiang, the pre-secession movement in Tibet. I'm not talking about Taiwan, which is a different issue. India might also face the very complicated problem of, for example, there are 100 million Muslims in this 1.2 strong billion Indian population, and that could be a serious obstacle in the way of India's economic development. Don't forget how and why the first India-Pakistan war broke out, and the third such a war between the two major countries in South-Asia subcontinent led to the independence of Bangladesh, largely due to the same problem of Muslims, Islamic ethnicity. What do you think of the adversity of having such strong ethnic problems in India? Will that be a serious obstacle to its development and the rise of being a global power in the foreseeable future?
It has always been a big issue, and it always, I think, it's going to be a big sort of problem facing India if India as it grows, as it develops. And I think if you look at the past 5, 6, 7 decades, as we are now today celebrating the independence of India, and it is also a good time to reflect how far and how much progress India has made in this regard. I think the previous government, to be fair, that particularly under the Jawaharlal Nehru, and they made it very clear, I think, two things. One is the secularism, right? Make sure that there's a separation between religion and politics, because India, we know, is a very much religious sort of nation. And the second thing is inclusiveness. That is, make sure that the majorities and the minority groups would have a harmonious relation. Because this we have a bad lesson. It is because the majority Hindus were not able, or the minority Muslims were not able feel comfortable to live with the post sort of independence of India. That's why we had that bloody partition and created the problem. Until now, they are disturbing affecting India and
particularly
the
the
continent.
issue of Kashmir
That's
and
right.
Jammu.
That's right. So I think as we move ahead, and in the electoral politics, in a democracy like India, this issue, this problem, if we're not able to solve it properly, then I think it will continue as it happened in the past, affect India, I mean, in a way ahead. And I'm a little bit worried as we go on. More reports are coming now. There are some, certainly the rise because of the BJP and the rise of Hindu nationalism, and the incident like the against the cow slaughters, because cow is sacred for Hindus. And there are other incidents like that. So I thought that I hope that the democracy with Indian characters will continue to deliver, and it will continue to be effective in solving the problems, and particularly on the two issues I mentioned, the secularism and the inclusiveness.
I'm afraid Hindus is both religion and nationalism. Now, if it's taken as a serious religion, then it could be a driving force for the solidarity of the BJP. For example, what Prime Minister Modi did since 2014 when he took office was exactly try to align the BJP with all other major groups with the religious conviction of Hindu. Is that true, Professor Nalapad? So that the issue of a caste system could also be solved properly.
Well, I'd like to. Well, on the caste system, as I told you, Prime Minister Modi comes from a very backward caste, and he has tried to bring those backward castes into the BJP, and frankly, that is one of the secrets of his immense political success. So far as different religions are concerned, the problem with the Nehruvian construct was that Nehru, in a sense, separated the minority from the majority, and he gave special privileges to the minority across the country that were denied to the majority. This created a sense of resentment in the majority, and that has led to a backlash, which some aspects of it we are seeing now. It's very important that every person, irrespective of religion, be treated equally, and Prime Minister Modi is talking of Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas, which means I am for all and I am for the development of all. Ultimately, the panacea is economic development. Why is it that, for example, in China, there's so much pride in the country? It's because, you know, in 1949, you were half the size of India economically, and today you're 4.5 times the size of India. You have grown enormously, while we haven't been able to grow at all at the rate you have grown. And the reason for that is not because of there is too much democracy, but there's too little democracy in the administration. So you have to decentralize the administration. You have to ensure that the various restrictions and regulations are removed. It's much easier to operate a business in China than in India. A mayor in China has more power than a chief minister of a big Indian state in India. So there has to be a decentralization of power. There has to be a situation which the bureaucracy is less intrusive in the lives of people, and this is what the young people of India are fighting for. And don't forget, people below 35 account for 70% of my country. I come from a very young country, a country that is on smartphones. Incidentally, a lot of these smartphones are Chinese made. A country that is in the English language. About 300 million people in India speak English, with more joining every week. So this is a country which is immensely confident of the future, but that future has got to be where the colonial bureaucracy is changed into a democratic kind of bureaucracy, such that we see, for example, in countries where Indians do very well, like the US or the UK.
Well, in India, other than the integrity of democracy, English could also be said to be a universal language, right, for elites and the poor, poverty-stricken population. Now, with the Cold War coming to an end 26 years ago, Governor Chris Patten, the last governor of Hong Kong, said in an exclusive interview with me many years ago, "Look, Yang Rui, there is a communist party in both India and China, but the problem with the Indians is that they believe in communism." What do you think of his note of sarcasm here?
Well, I'd simply like to say that I wish our communists will follow the example of Deng Xiaoping. In fact, not only communists, but other politicians should follow the example of Deng Xiaoping and put development first and put economic growth first. China is a model for the whole world in the way it is developed. And frankly, I believe Prime Minister Modi has studied the life of Deng Xiaoping, has studied the policies of Deng Xiaoping, and we are hoping that the next 30 years in India will be like the 30 years, after Deng Xiaoping took over authority by about the early 1980s. So we have a lot to learn from China, and we acknowledge that China has done much better than we have in providing a better life for its people.
We appreciate your sense of humility regarding the success of China's market economy. Now, Mr. Carrefour, what do you think of the coalition government or the Indian Parliament? Is it purely a British legacy, or is it just yet another raw example of Oriental cultures? By Oriental cultures, we would start to think more about cultural diversity, of course. It's not exactly what the UK has practiced.
Well, I was referring to the impact of the parliamentary system, legislative procedures, the way the parliament works, the way you move legislation, debate, etc., and also the legal system that the British part legacy there, kind of an organized legal system. So I think those have been positive structurally. But as you well point out, naturally they're going to be adopted to local characteristics, and I think that's been the case in India.
As a senior expert of military affairs, let me remind you of what Western politicians tend to say: democracies, or Western democracies, don't go to war.
Well,
but
that's,
failed states tend to. China is certainly not a Western democracy. Over the issue of border disputes, do you think these two major economies are likely to go to war?
Well, I think there's a debate in Western political scientists about democracies going to war. And actually, if you take a look at World War I, democracies, so-called, went to war. So there's a fallacy in that democracies don't go to war, argued by a number of, I think, serious professors. So I don't think it's the structure, democracies or non-democracies going to war. It's the circumstances and the strategic interests, et cetera, that push. The Socialist Party in Germany voted for the war in World War I. They voted the funding for the war. So even the left has responsibility.
We don't have enough time for Mr. Roying to take a closer look at how Chinese political institutions have worked and worked so well. Actually, China's one-party political system is based on political consultation and meritocracy, so to speak. Daniel Bell, a senior Canadian professor, may have a better understanding about that. I'm not here to promote the sale of his book, but I'll see you next time. Tomorrow, the same time, about the third chapter of our special series for rediscovering India. Until then, goodbye.